It wasn't a question of turning to performance art. It happened by increments. When I went to the main art school in York Street, there seemed to be these other tutors who were talking about moving outside of the space, engaging socially or publicly with the environment. And I understood that to be not only the physical environment, but the psychological and psychic environment of Belfast and mentally and culturally the Troubles. It was often about confronting aspects of myself, my family, community, and culture that actually I didn't really want to confront. So I think looking back on it, and I say this with humility, that I think it was quite courageous what I was doing. But I wasn't aware how, I was young. I mean, I was like 18, 19 doing this stuff. And I just thought I could do it. I thought, if I'm going to survive and not be a victim, I have to put myself out there. I am not going to hide. I felt powerless in the face of certain things that were going on in my own community, with things like, paramilitary intrusion on and kind of ways of behavior, conditioning within one's own community. And then the external forces that impacted upon that through British colonialism, having British troops in the street, being searched, stopped, all that stuff going on constantly. It was almost like I was against any kind of authority, local and governmental, from London, if you like, through the British Army. So it was confronting all that and trying to say, well, there are things that I'm powerless over, but if I make art, I can place myself in another position, which is almost a kind of liminal position in between things. And somehow I felt that would protect me. And I think it did, because I could use art as a kind of protection to discuss all these things. The Schenkel butcher knives that started to appear in the performances in the church around 1979, 1980, that period. And that was at the point where the Schenkel butcher gang were actually being convicted. They were in court. So the whole history leading up to that was obviously something everyone knew about, and was one of those sorts of series of events which I think they were kind of like, I don't mean to suggest that they weren't important, but they had a kind of low-level impact because they were so sinister and almost sort of unbelievable, because body parts were being left around Belfast, people were being picked up. Through the years when they were active, people didn't really know what was taking place. And then when the facts emerged, they were quite extraordinary. And I was trying to come to terms with how an environment had almost made these people, and a culture had made these people, and what they felt they were doing was absolutely right. And I felt that it had come out of my Protestant background. And I sort of understood something about how far human beings could go and were capable of doing anything. I almost put it on the level of the Holocaust in terms of how individuals respond or react to a situation where the incremental violence becomes, it allows more violence to take place to the point where you become immune. And I thought, you know what? I could be like that. And there were points where I was going through these actions in the church where I was putting myself through very extreme physical situations, like binding myself up, breaking my teeth, cutting my mouth. And that all had to do with not having a sense of voice, and also a sense of incredibly low self-esteem, having no value. And it was confronting those attitudes about my own identity within my culture that I knew that actually I'm capable of this violence, and I'm capable of taking it out on something or someone else. The most important thing for me, not to be a victim, is to confront this. And the way that I started confronting it was, the first notion was, I'm going to make a set of replica knives based on the knives that the Schenkel butchers used. And they were scale replicas. And I started incorporating those into the performances. So they were used to do things like chop up meat or viscera within the performance and tie it to the body. And so that the body becomes dehumanized in a way. And there wasn't any specific Schenkel butcher performance, but it was another kind of coded material within the performances that would relate to an environment such as Belfast. That kind of abuse of human rights on any kind of level. The taking away of human characteristics, the disembodiment, the viscera, and trying to work through in a whole series of performances, which occasionally I would keep coming back to throughout the 1980s. And it finally reached a conclusion in 1991 when I made a performance called Romper Room. And the Romper Room was the place where the butchers would take their victims, which was also the name of an Ulster television children's program. You know, so it was incredibly sinister, and I almost can't find the words to describe what this was. And I think that's why I was making the actions, because I couldn't describe the feeling I had for what this was about. It was so dark, and it went to the core of something within myself that I found it difficult to deal with. And I was trying to work that out through these performances. So the last performance, it was a bit over the top, really. But then it was like, well, it's not a little theatrical play that we're doing here, you know. It starts off with something that might be kind of quite banal, and then it kind of builds up to the point where, you know, I have a plastic doll and I'm shoving things up its ass, and it's wearing a mask that has, you know, Lenny Murphy's face on it, the leader of the Schenkel Butcher. It really gets out of hand, you know. But it's like, well, you know, is there something, it's almost like I can't believe I'm saying this, is there something weirdly homoerotic about this? These gangs of men getting together and cutting up their victims? I mean, there was something so dark and sinister about this that I've never been able to get a handle on, you know. But there are other correlations with this in terms of the Troubles. I made a piece about the Kincora Boys Home, you know, and sexual abuse in the Kincora Boys Home, you know. And, you know, there are victims of that who are still alive. But at one point, there was a torso found of one of the kids in the lagoon. You know, people forget about this kind of the extreme of things that happened during the Troubles, you know. You know, I remember seeing, you know, limbs in a street after a bomb, you know, and kind of almost being disassociated from it, not being able to understand what had been taking place, and to think this was a person, you know. I remember reading a report of an observer of there was a bomb on Oxford Street bus station, and they'd said that it blew out the bodies through the iron railings, and the bodies were stuck in the iron railings. Bits had been blown through and bits were stuck. Can you imagine bits of someone's body stuck in iron railings? And there's bits all over the street, you know. I mean, that's the kind of landscape we're talking about. I mean, I don't think people should forget about that. And when I reflect on all that, it brings it all back. I think, you know what? I don't want to forget that. I mean, that's a real tragedy. No, I'm not going to go into a whole social, you know, contextual kind of argument about, or political argument about why all these things have taken place. We all know about that. But I think at its most basic level, what are human beings capable of? What created the Shankill Butcher gang? How were they capable of doing what they did? You know, and for me, those knives are the symbol of what they did. You know, they're butcher knives, and they were well used.